A couple of years ago when I had just started my college career, I met a guy on Tinder. His name was Stuart, and he was very attractive. He was 20 years old, dark hair and a slight beard that looked very sexy to me. In his pictures he looked pretty good, but his profile didn't say much about him, just that he loved animals and outdoor activities, all cliché, but I was still interested. After we managed to make a match, he messaged me, said hello, and I responded immediately. The conversation started simply enough. He asked me how I was and how I was doing, and after that we started talking about everything and getting to know each other better. We exchanged messages for a couple of days and he seemed like a cool person, so it didn't take long before we agreed to go out. He asked me where I wanted to go and I suggested a restaurant downtown that was close to my house. He thought it was a good idea and we agreed to meet there the next night at 7 p.m. I was really quite excited about this meeting. The conversations with Stuart were very entertaining and he seemed like a great person, so I had high expectations about our meeting. I wasn't a newbie on Tinder. I had met several people before and had also had a couple of disappointments, but this time things were looking good. A little before I left, I messaged him to confirm that I would be attending, then got ready and headed out to the venue. Luckily, the restaurant was only 10 minutes from my house and looked quite nice. There were several people there, but we had arranged to meet at 7 p.m., and since it was 6:50 p.m., I wasn't sure if Stuart had arrived yet. I looked on Tinder, but there was no news from him. I let him know I was on my way, and he said great. I waited in my car for a while, and when 7 p.m. came on the dot, I decided to go inside. I thought maybe he was already inside waiting for me, so I walked through the door and got a table, told the waiter I was expecting someone, and then texted Stuart letting him know I was already in the place. A few minutes went by and he didn't answer me, which started to frustrate me a bit. When 7:15 p.m. rolled around, I texted him again to ask what was going on, but he didn't respond either. After staying until 7:30 p.m., I refused to wait any longer and decided to leave and go home. I was pretty upset, I won't deny it, but as I was driving back, I noticed that a car had been following me for a while. I was very upset thinking about the jilting Stuart had given me and I wasn't paying attention at all, so I didn't know if it was coming from the restaurant or not. When I took the first turn, the car continued behind me, but it got really weird when I got to my street. As I turned, so did the car. My street is one of those with almost no traffic, so it struck me powerfully that this car followed me there, since it was very unlikely that I lived in the same place or that I happened to be visiting someone near my house. However, coincidences also happen, and I really wish this was the case. Upon arriving home, I pulled into the driveway and the car continued to move very slowly behind me. Still, I went about my business, parked, and before getting out, I pulled out the canister of pepper spray I always carry with me from my purse and hid it inside my jacket. As I got out of the car, I looked at the other car moving slowly down the street. I never got a good look at who was behind the wheel. The thought that it might be Stuart fleetingly crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. That was too weird. I mean, why choose to follow me home instead of meeting me at the restaurant? Unless I was dealing with a weirdo. That didn't make much sense, and truth be told, he didn't seem like one at all. After I went back inside, I checked Tinder and Stuart was still silent. I sent him another message asking why he hadn't shown up, but when I saw that he didn't reply, I decided it was time to let it go. I figured I had no real connection with Stuart. I was just really upset because I had made plans and he didn't show up. That was really lame of him, and if that's how it was on a first date, I definitely didn't want to imagine what it would be like in a relationship. So I set about cooking some pasta and tried to put the whole thing with Stuart behind me. I was living alone at the time, so I was in my living room enjoying my meal, when I noticed that same car driving by again. It had been at least 40 minutes since I got home, and now it was coming from across the street. When it stopped right in front of my house, I stared out the window without being seen. I started to get nervous. It was definitely the same car that had been following me, and I saw that the engine stayed on for a while before turning off. Without thinking twice, I called the police. I told them that I thought someone was following me and that it was now parked right outside my house. As I spoke, I kept looking at the car, which showed no signs of life. I had no idea who it might be, so I simply waited. The car remained there with all the lights off, and there was only a dim street light illuminating the area a little. About 10 minutes passed, and suddenly I saw a police car roll down my street. It approached the car that was stopped in front of my house, turned on its lights, and an officer got out to talk to the driver. I watched the conversation carefully, which lasted about 5 minutes, and finally, the car drove off, and the officer approached me. He told me that the guy in the car claimed to be lost and that he had stopped to check directions. I didn't believe it for a second, so I opened Tinder to show the officer what Stewart looked like and asked the officer if it was the same guy. Yes, it was him, he told me. I couldn't believe it. Stewart had followed me home, but why? What for? I talked to the officer some more and told him who I was and all about the date and stuff, but he said they couldn't do anything unless he came back or something. I was very puzzled. I didn't understand why this guy would do something like that, but then the officer told me something that gave me chills. He told me that it wasn't the same person and maybe it wasn't the same situation, but recently, they had caught a predator who would contact his victims on Tinder and after asking them out, follow them to their house just like Stewart had done with me, and then break in, sexually assault them and steal all their valuables. As you can imagine, the very idea made my blood run cold. The policeman stressed to me that the man he was talking about was already behind bars, but there are a lot of weirdos out there, and it was better to be forewarned, so he suggested that I secure my house well, left me his number and told me not to hesitate to call him if I saw him hanging around again. I nodded immediately and didn't hesitate to pass keys and locks on doors and windows when the officer left. I also blocked Stewart on Tinder, and fortunately, never heard from him again. However, I was paranoid for weeks, thinking that at some point he might return, but that thankfully didn't happen. When I was 22 years old, I lived in a half-fancy housing development in Brooklyn. I shared a 2-bedroom apartment with a lesbian roommate named Andrea. Truth be told, there wasn't much chemistry between us. At the time, I often dated guys I met online, and truth be told, most of the dates were pretty boring, until I met Red. He and I met through Tinder, and we agreed to go out for beers at my favorite bar, a place called Beer Paradise. This bar was brutal because it had a wide variety of craft beers and was filled with 80s arcade games, all coin-operated. There you had everything from Pac-Man to Space Invaders to Gauntlet. What I didn't know was that choosing that bar could change everything for me. That night I got to the place first, so I ordered a beer and started playing for a few minutes. But as soon as I started, Red walked in the door and greeted me with a big smile. I immediately challenged him to play some games, and we had a great time, taking turns and cheering each other on. But shortly after a couple of rounds of games and beer, Red started to get restless and wanted us to go home, saying things like, "This is not a good place to talk." At first I didn't think much of it because I still had several quarters and figured he was just a little nervous. I finished my second beer and ordered another. That was usually my limit, because I'm not the world's best drinker, and I don't like to abuse alcohol. Just then I saw my favorite game come on and excitedly ran over to play. I put a coin in, but I didn't manage to coordinate very well. Henceforth, all I did was lose, and I started to get a little frustrated. After the first round, I was weirded out, because I'm usually good at that game. I always beat everyone. When I told Red, a little hurt in my pride, that I'm usually not that bad with only 2 beers on me, he became even more insistent and said that this place was too crowded to have a decent conversation, and he wanted to go somewhere quieter. I didn't understand. We had barely been there for about half an hour and I had wanted to have a fun time. I just wanted to get to know him better, so I insisted on playing around some more. Trying to evade his insistence, I put another coin into the game, determined to put on a good show. But this time not only did I get stuck on the first round, but I couldn't even hold the joystick properly. I started to feel very dizzy and couldn't coordinate my movements well. It was at that moment that things started to become clear in my head. I realized that this was not normal, and I remembered that Red had been the one who brought me my second beer, the one I had just drank and from which I started to feel strange. I realized that if my suspicions were true, I was in a truly dangerous mess and that I had to act fast with a cool head, so I did the only thing I could think of doing in that situation. I apologized and pretended I had to go to the bathroom urgently, but in reality when I was there, I took out my phone and called my roommate Andrea and desperately asked her for help. Although we lived only a few blocks away, she was at her girlfriend's house about 15 minutes away by cab, and she was busy in the middle of her date. I pleaded with her and even offered to pay for not only her dinner but any expenses she had. In the end, she decided to come get me. While I waited, I stayed in the bathroom, feeling more and more nervous and losing a little control of my movements with each passing minute. There were women coming in and out, and I kept asking them to check if he was still there. My hands were shaking and my heart was racing. I was sweating too much and my mind was starting to disconnect from reality, so I had to hold on with all my might to whatever vestige of consciousness I had. Suddenly, I started having hallucinations. I saw lights, shadows, colors, and shapes that blurred in the air. I heard noises that I could not understand, but I constantly repeated to myself that I had to keep calm, that nothing was real. But I was starting to panic, or in hysteria. It was like a mixture of both. I don't even know how I was able to keep control of myself, but somehow I did. I guess the human mind is much more powerful than we imagine. Why at that moment my conscious side was struggling not to succumb to the effect of whatever they had put in my drink. Suddenly, I began to feel like I was losing control, as the faces of those who entered were distorted and I heard voices, bells, sirens. It was totally desperate and terrifying. Suddenly I ran to the nearest sink, which I could see blurred and as if it was melting. Then I started to drink all the water I could, but a lot, until I started to feel horrible nausea and began to vomit. I threw up a lot, so much that I felt like I was going to pass out and my chest hurt from retching so much. But somehow this helped. Several of the girls who came into the bathroom helped me and one of them gave me something to drink. I don't know what it was and why I accepted to drink whatever a stranger gave me, but little by little I started to come to my senses. And after about 15 minutes, the girls started to tell me that he was already gone, but I didn't feel safe enough to leave. So I stayed in the bathroom for a while longer while I recovered a bit, waiting for Andrea to show up. After what seemed like an eternity, finally my roommate came in and led me out of the bar. I could barely walk, so it was more like a crawl, if you can imagine. Amazingly, she, who was pretty drunk at the time, was still upset that I had interrupted her date. So instead of taking me back to the apartment, she decided to take me to an atmospheric bar that was nearby, and there I sat for the next 2 hours, while she partied with some friends and another girl she met at the place. My memory of that part is a little murky, but I know we were there, and after that, I have like some kind of picture of me in the back of her car, and then I just remember waking up in the middle of the night in my bed with horrible cramps all over my body that I couldn't control, and from there, I don't remember anything else until the next morning, when I just felt a brutal headache. I never heard from Red again, and the first thing I did was block him on Tinder, not without first reporting his account. But a couple of days after the incident, I received a call from an unknown number. It was a woman yelling at me, cursing me for 30 seconds before threatening to kill me and then hanging up. I don't know why, but I'm sure that call was connected to Red. However, I decided not to do anything else and just try to forget about it. Clearly, I never forgot about it, nor will I ever. But luckily, I have never experienced anything like that again. I am now very careful when I go out with guys and I never let them touch my drinks. This happened about 12 years ago after I was out of the dating game for about 2 years after breaking up with my boyfriend of 3 years at the time. I'm a pretty shy person and don't go out much, so my best friend pushed me to try online dating, which is pretty common. I mean, a lot of people get started in the online dating world spurred on by a friend who is tired of seeing them single. Anyway, at that time I thought it could be fun, so I registered on OkCupid, a site that was very popular in those years when there was no Tinder. The idea was to chat with people for a while, get to know them better and distinguish who was weird and who wasn't, to end up finding someone interesting to date. That's how I met a guy named Philip, and we spent a couple of weeks exchanging messages. The truth is that he seemed like a nice guy, quiet and a bit peculiar, but not as much as others I had talked to. When the time came, he asked me out, and of course I was excited to meet him, so I said yes. I mentioned to him that I preferred low-key dates, so he proposed that I go to his house where he would cook us dinner, and then we would watch some independent horror movies, which was something we both enjoyed. I told my friend about this, and even though she was the one who suggested online dating, we had a conversation about the risks of going straight to her house without meeting first in a public place. I knew it was a gamble, but that wasn't what I was most worried about. Besides, I'm 5'8" and he's barely 5'7". I knew this because I asked him about it in one of our previous conversations. I didn't care that he was shorter than me, as it meant he'd be less likely to stand up to me if the date went wrong. Of course, that's completely irrelevant considering I'm a girl, but in some crazy way that made me feel safe. Plus, I can't lie, the truth is I suck at cooking, and her offer to cook for me, I was done with it. That said, when I got to her house, my friend and I had a code word system that we could use by text or call. She had all my contact information, so if things didn't go well, I could text her the code word, and she would think of an excuse to come pick me up. Finally, the day of the appointment came, and when I arrived, he started showing me around his apartment. He was very nice, and at first everything was pleasant, until we got to his room and he started getting a little heavy talking about his bedroom and how comfortable his bed was. I thought these were awkward comments and quite out of line, so I asked him to change the subject nicely. He nodded and apologized, making a half-joking clarification about how he didn't mean to make me uncomfortable and that he didn't know I was so shy. He then led me to the kitchen, and I thought that was the time he would start preparing dinner. But then he raved about a brownie he had made and how amazed I was going to be at his talent in the kitchen. But when the time came, I realized that he hadn't bought anything to cook that night. Instead, he showed up with a bottle of an Irish liqueur that he told me was very fine and one of the most exquisite drinks in the world. I made the mistake of arriving on an empty stomach, thinking he was actually going to cook something, so upon realizing there was going to be no dinner, in addition to being disappointed, I was a little frustrated, but instead of understanding why I was upset, the guy just kept talking about how much I had spent on that bottle, as if I should be grateful that he had gone out of his way to get it. Don't get me wrong, I like liquor, but I'm not an expert at it, nor am I much of an alcohol lover, so for me, that bottle could be the most expensive or the cheapest in the store, and I'd never know, I told him honestly. He laughed at my comment and poured me some in a glass, telling me to give his bottle a try and that I wouldn't regret it. So instead of dinner, we ended up arguing about the blissfully fine Irish liquor, which I admit was good, but not so good as to justify the $150 he said he spent on it. The first warning sign came when I noticed that he was purposely trying to get me drunk. Every time I barely took a sip, he would get excited and want to fill my glass again. Drinking so repeatedly, combined with no dinner, made me start to feel uncomfortable. I still thought maybe he was just trying to be romantic and was being awkward. So after forcing him to let me eat some fries and a piece of the brownie he had told me about, I decided to go through with the date and see what happened. I mean, he was drinking quite a bit too, and I thought a lot of guys just act like that for show, but he seemed to drink liquor like there was no tomorrow. Finally, after I kept track of my drinking, we ended up on the couch to watch a movie. I asked him what he had chosen, and he pretended to be saving the surprise until the end. He had been telling me how awesome his choice was, so I was dying of curiosity because I knew he had good taste and we both loved independent horror films. However, instead of an unknown gem, he pulls out the Serbian Sarpiski film. For those who don't know, that film is famous for being one of the most graphic and disturbing films ever made, and many view it with marketing opinions about it. But I really hate it. It's just a combination of gratuitous violence and mindless grotesque stuff, plus an absolutely disgusting and twisted sexual charge. So when he suggested putting it on, I politely asked him if I had no choice, since I'd already seen it and didn't feel like reviewing something so horrible again. But no, he insisted that we had to see it, and when he tried to tell me that he just didn't appreciate it because he didn't understand it, I knew this guy wasn't going on a second date with me. Trying to stay calm, I pulled out my phone to text my friend with our emergency code word, but as soon as I started typing, the guy became vocally uncomfortable and asked who I was texting. His tone and attitude reaffirmed to me that there would definitely be no second date, but I kept my cool and replied that I was just letting a friend know I would be late. This was part of a plan I had with my friend, and it worked perfectly, so Philip swallowed it, completely believing it was all good. Then I went back to relaxing. A few minutes later, my friend calls me and puts on an Oscar-worthy performance, saying that there had been a break-in at our apartment, even though there really wasn't. I turned up the volume so the guy could hear, and I just had to act normal for everything to flow. My friend asked if I needed him to pick me up from somewhere, and as part of the show I told him the guy's full address, even the zip code, so he understood that someone knew where I was. Unfortunately, things don't always go perfectly. I thought my friend would be there in about 10 to 15 minutes, but then she told me she had to drop her little sister off to a sleepover at a friend's house, which was going to take over 40 minutes. I was very angry, as it looked like the plan had turned into a total disaster due to the fact that she had had to do a favor for her mom, whose car was in the shop. So I still had to endure another 40 minutes of that awful movie with a guy who got weirder and creepier as he drank. The next 30 minutes were absolute torture. Philip went on to lecture me about why the Serbian film is the best indie horror film since the Blair Witch Project, claiming that its brutality was a reflection of society's decay and a bunch of nonsense that was boggling my mind. As the movie progressed, things got weirder and more disturbing, especially when a super grotesque scene involving a child came along. I don't want to go into details because honestly it's so gross and twisted I couldn't even describe it. Plus, I don't want to traumatize anyone. But when that horrible part came, he started breathing very hard through his nose, insisting that we turn off the lights. I agreed, but you can imagine how unsettling it is to feel that heavy breathing right next door in a dark room and in front of such a grotesque and gruesome scene. The sense of dread was too much. At one point, I turned a little to see what he was doing and found him watching the screen silently, a rare sight for him. Then I turned to him, told him I wouldn't watch anymore, but he just emitted a strange "Ujum" before moving over to my side of the couch, so we were closer together, our hips almost touching. I immediately told him it was too soon for that kind of intimacy, and tried to put distance between the two of us by nudging him slightly with the palm of my hands, but he just groaned and replied, "Why not?" in a tone that I found repulsive. Fortunately, it was getting close to time for me to leave, so that would serve as an excuse for me not to move on anything. But he seemed to think I owed him something, as if he really believed it was time to do something else. Two waves of discomfort hit me right away. The first was when he leaned into me in a more than weird way, and the physical contact made my skin crawl, but not in a pleasant way, believe me. But the second wave, the one that really hit me, was realizing that, after seeing some of the most grotesque, horrible, and disgusting scenes on screen, that guy felt like kissing me and whatnot. I can't describe how scared I felt at that moment. I pulled back a little, trying to establish distance again, but he tried to place his hand on my thigh, and that's when I decided enough was enough. I wasn't going to stay one more minute in that dark apartment of this weird, creepy guy, so I jumped off the couch, grabbed my purse, and told him I was leaving right then and there. I walked straight for the door, praying he wouldn't try to make a scene in the hallway, but luckily he didn't follow me out, although his behavior at the end was just as scary. I imagined myself walking down the corridor almost blind, afraid that he would appear behind me with something sharp. Then, suddenly, I heard a strange scream coming from him. It was a strange and somber sound, but I didn't even bother to turn around. I rather accelerated my pace and barely managed to open the door because it was locked. As soon as I set foot outside, I ran down the stairs and out of the building. Paranoia overcame me, and I was convinced that Philip was coming after me with a knife or a baseball bat or something creepy. But in the end, he wasn't, thank God. Still, that fear wouldn't leave me alone as I walked down the street, glancing over my shoulder every second to make sure I was alone. As I walked, I called my friend and asked her to please hurry. Fortunately, she told me she was only a couple of minutes away, but only when I saw her car approaching did I finally feel out of danger, or at least in my mind, since I didn't know the area very well. On the way back, I told her how what started out as a quiet date had turned into a complete nightmare. She stretched at the funny part of the story, but was terrified when I got to the part about the movie and how he had reacted. Hearing about the terrifying moment she had just experienced, my friend apologized for taking so long to arrive, but of course I forgave her. It wasn't her fault she was dealing with a family problem. She was just very traumatized by having to wait so long. Before Philip could try to contact me again, I blocked her number in a desperate attempt to get that crazy man out of my life. However, after several days of ruminating on the incident, I decided that it wasn't enough just to ignore him. Maybe he didn't try to hurt me that night, but my gut told me it was only a matter of time before this guy did something serious. I know it's not illegal to have an awkward date, and I'll probably sound paranoid, but I ended up calling the police just to tell them what happened. They acknowledged that it was very uncomfortable and upsetting what I had experienced, but they told me that there really wasn't any crime they could charge him with, and being that he hadn't contacted me again either, he didn't qualify for a restraining order either. Nothing he had done was a crime, and I understood that trying to report him for just touching my thigh would be pointless. But the officers were kind and wrote down his name in case there was any trouble in the future, thanking me for calling it in. That made me feel that, in a way, I had done something to prevent a tragedy. Part of me hopes that the police had warned him, though maybe that's just wishful thinking on my part. The truth is that experience left me unmotivated for online dating for quite a while, and it wasn't until Bumble came along that I really started to get serious about an escape in my love life. This happened in 2016 when I was younger and a bit more naive. It was the first and only time I decided to use a dating app to meet guys, since I was single and thought, why not give it a try? I don't remember the name of the app, but soon after I met a guy, we immediately started chatting, and based on his picture and what we talked about in the beginning, it seemed like everything was going perfect. The guy's name was Alan, and he looked tall, muscular, and had brown hair. We started talking about trivial things, trying to get to know each other a little more, but after a couple of days of conversation, he asked me if I wanted to go out. I actually thought it was a bit rushed, but I was a bit bored and with no plans for that weekend, so I decided to be a bit adventurous for the first time, and on an impulse I said yes, although now I think it was rather quirky nonsense. Upon agreeing to the outing, Alan pitched me that he wanted our date to be that same day at his house. At that moment, a small alarm went off in my head. Of course, I knew it wasn't the best idea in the world to agree to go to a stranger's house on a first date. I knew it would be much smarter to meet someone for the first time in a public place, but still completely ignoring my own warnings, I felt safe to take that step. Even though we hadn't exchanged pictures or talked on the phone, I told him I would go. Then he sent me his address, telling me to get there early because he was bored and wanted to see a movie and order pizza. That sounded like a great plan to me, so I figured I could stay for a couple of hours at most. It was around 7 or 8 p.m. at that point. I quickly got ready, copied their address and pasted it into Google Maps to get directions. The location was about 10 minutes from where I lived, which I thought was great because it wasn't too far, so I could be back home early. The address looked very normal, with residence numbers and the street name, but when I got there, I found myself on a deserted, dark street. I turned right as the map instructed and suddenly realized I was pulling into the parking lot of a rundown motel. What is this, I wondered, immediately feeling frustrated and a little scared. What the hell was Alan doing there? Why instead of his house was there a creepy motel? At that moment, my instincts were telling me I should turn around and leave immediately, but what do you think? Exactly. I didn't. Instead, I pulled into one of the parking spaces that led to the rooms. The motel had 2 floors and approximately 20 rooms in total, 10 on each level. This parking lot was a long row of spaces leading to the motel doors, and there was a curb in the middle, where there were about 5 other cars and, to be honest, not many people. After parking, I looked around the rooms and noticed that there were some lights on, though not many. Most of the windows were covered with curtains. I stayed in my car and pulled out my phone to message Alan on the app, asking him why he hadn't told me he was at a motel. He replied that he was sorry and that he didn't want to scare me because he really wanted to see me. He then explained that he was only at that motel for a couple of days until he could start renting his new apartment. Alan went on to tell me that he had all his stuff in storage nearby and that the lease on his old apartment was up sooner than he expected. It was a rather long and confusing message, but in the end I understood that he was just staying at that motel while he made the move. Deep down I believed him, because up to that point he had been quite nice. Although that was a mistake on my part, clearly. But at the time I was too young and too naive, and I used to believe people right off the bat. I thought someone as nice as Alan couldn't be dangerous or evil. Of course, I think very differently now, but what can I tell you? I was young and foolish. I told Alan that I was sorry that his apartment wasn't ready, but I also let him know that I was a little uncomfortable with the place and that the motel looked rather strange. He apologized again and told me that he didn't mean to make me uncomfortable, but it was the only thing he could afford for now. Then he told me that if I didn't like the place and wanted to cancel our meeting, he would understand. That made me feel bad. I really felt like I was despising him, and what he told me about leaving was enough to dispel my doubts and convince me that everything was fine with him. That is, if it was someone with bad intentions, he wouldn't give me the option to leave. That was what I naively thought, completely unaware that that was precisely the intention of those words. After this interaction, I told him I would stay. He asked me to please come in and gave me his room number. I looked up at his window and noticed that it was one of the few rooms with the light on. It was on the 2nd floor and a little to my left. I stayed in my car for a moment thinking about it. The truth is that I was still feeling nervous, as if my instinct was warning me, but I tried to convince myself that it was normal to feel that way, and I attributed that feeling of nervousness to being very excited to meet Alan in person. So I opened the door and got out of the car, but just as I closed it behind me, I noticed something that caught my attention. I looked up at his bedroom window and saw a man looking out of it, but it wasn't Alan. As soon as the guy saw me, he ducked down and pulled the curtain right away, so I only saw him for a moment. But it was enough to realize that he didn't look anything like Alan's picture. At that instant, I thought there was probably someone else with him, and I stood right next to my car, not taking another step. I pulled out my phone and texted him asking who was in his room. Then he responded quickly, saying he was alone. That couldn't be true. I had seen a completely different man there, I was sure. After that, my feeling that things were taking a strange and dangerous turn only increased, so I decided it would be best to turn around and get back to my car quickly. Once inside, I told Alan that I had seen someone at his window and that it wasn't him. He immediately said something like, "No, it's not. You're wrong." But I had already made the decision to leave, and without thinking about it, I started and left the place as fast as I could. The craziest thing of all is that it was only when I was at home that I realized that surely the Alan I had met didn't really exist, and that the other man I had seen in his window could be the one who had been sending me messages and pretending to be someone else all that time. Then all the pieces began to fit together in my head, and I realized how naive and careless I had been, and what a dangerous situation I had put myself in by not thinking with a cool head. As I became aware of what was probably really going on, I blocked Alan out immediately. I wanted absolutely nothing to do with that guy ever again. Thankfully, I never heard from him again, or whoever was behind Alan's facade, but I'm absolutely certain that whatever he wanted to do with me, it wasn't good at all. I still get chills every time I think about what might have happened if I hadn't seen that man at the window before I went up to that room. If you think about it, many things we do on a daily basis are potentially dangerous and put us at risk without even realizing it. For example, when you get into an Uber, you trust your safety to a complete stranger, or when you call a plumber and let a stranger into your home, let alone a locksmith. But probably, at one of the highest places on that scale, are dating apps, something that today is completely normal and used by millions of people around the world to romantically connect with strangers. However, I don't think I need to explain to you the level of risk we expose ourselves to every time we pause a meeting with a perfect stranger. It's funny how when it comes to love, even the most cautious of us forget that the dangers are not always so obvious. That danger is always lurking, waiting for you to let your guard down to give you a surprise. And that happened to me. I didn't see what was coming, and that carelessness almost cost me my life. It all started after a messy breakup with my ex, Derek. During that relationship, I had to deal with a lot of violence and harassment issues, and the worst part is that I felt like I couldn't let him go because he was my first love. He always made me feel like I didn't deserve anyone else, and I became a dependent person with no self-esteem. Ending the relationship was an emotional roller coaster, but as soon as I had the courage to break up with him, another nightmare began. Derek would show up at my house at all hours, send me intimidating messages, stalk me at work, and even harass my family. At first he tried to convince me to come back, but after several complaints he became aggressive and stopped talking to me, just watching me from afar, making it clear to me that he was still present, that he would not leave my life. Every time I saw him, I called the police, but they never managed to catch him. So the situation was frustrating, since I didn't have a restraining order because according to the police he did nothing but watch. In short, it seemed like they had to wait for me to do real harm before they could act. Laws can be a bit absurd at times, don't you think? However, after a series of threatening messages he had sent me on one of his days, I was finally ready to file a restraining order against him, but he suddenly disappeared from my sight overnight. It honestly felt great to not have Derek stalking me all the time, but I was terrified that this was just the calm before a new storm. However, as the months passed uneventfully, I began to feel like I was finally at peace. It took almost 2 years for me to feel ready to date again, and the only reason I perked up was because my friends insisted that I create a profile on Tinder while they were joking around and picking guys for me. At first I was making 1,000 excuses to reject everyone until I found one who really interested me. His name was Thomas, and he lived just a couple of miles from my area. According to his profile, he loved animals and seemed like a cool guy, and when I gave him a like, we matched right away. Despite my doubts, my friends pushed me to talk, and in fact I even installed Tinder on my cell phone, although I didn't use it much because we communicated through WhatsApp. Everything was going well with him, until, as expected, he asked me out to meet in person. I admit that I tried to delay that first date a bit. I told him about what I had been through with my ex and explained that it had left deep scars on me. But instead of freaking out, Thomas was very understanding and let me take it easy. until one day I felt ready and we decided to meet in the park for a drink. I was very excited, but still a bit anxious, I admit. When I arrived, Thomas was already waiting for me, and he looked exactly like his pictures, was handsome, and had a beautiful smile. However, as we started chatting, he gave me a strange impression. He acted normal, but there was something in the air that put me on alert. I didn't want to think about it and assumed it was all due to how traumatized my sick ex had left me. However, after a while of eating sandwiches and chatting, although everything seemed to be going well, I couldn't shake the feeling that Derek might be lurking. It had been quite some time since my last encounter with him, but for some reason my instincts were telling me I needed to be alert, and this feeling only grew as the minutes passed. At one point, that feeling of paranoia became so intense, I couldn't take it anymore and told Thomas that something wasn't right and I had to leave. "Hey, I'm sorry, this has nothing to do with you, but I really can't be calm. I'm really sorry, but I need to go," I told him, feeling really weird. He was sympathetic and told me it wasn't my fault, that he totally understood if I didn't feel safe, since I had been through so much. He seemed genuine, so when we said goodbye and I started walking, I felt a little bad for not giving him a chance. Maybe I was being too suspicious and paranoid. I felt terrible to think that maybe I was letting a great guy go by letting my traumas get the better of me. I was about to turn around and tell Thomas that I did want to go through with the date, when suddenly I felt a hand on my face. Suddenly, someone grabbed me from behind and covered my face with a bag. Was it Thomas? Had he gone crazy and was he trying to kill me? I started to struggle with my attacker, and in the middle of the struggle I turned around to see his face. It was definitely not Tom. This was even worse. It was Derek, my psycho ex. The instant I understood what was happening, I screamed at the top of my lungs as he grabbed me tighter and tighter so I couldn't escape. I recognized those arms, and the last thing I wanted was for him to be here. "Get off me!" I screamed as I tried to claw at his face or whatever it was to try to escape his grip, but to no avail. He then pushed me hard against the wall of the monument we were standing next to, causing me severe pain in the back of my head, which soon began to bleed. At that moment, Derek took advantage of my shock to press me with his body against the wall, and it was then that I felt a sharp object brush against my throat. It was a knife. I looked around desperately in search of someone who could help me, but the place was empty. There was no sign of anyone since I was near the exit, and this was quite far from the recreation area, where there was also almost no one because it was Tuesday afternoon. I thought about screaming and asking for help, but Darren pressed even more the knife against my throat and warned me, "Don't even think about it, because I'll slice your neck right here." This threat terrified me, because I knew he was so crazy that he was capable of that and more. "So you only needed 2 years to get over me, huh?" he said, closing the space between us even more. "Did you really think I'd let you date anyone else? No, little girl, that was just a trap. I saw you on Tinder talking to that guy all night. You have no idea how many times I got on your computer and even your phone. You've been running for 2 years, but I'm always one step behind you. You're mine, Suzanne. You can't change that, but I think the time has come for me to remind you." After those words, Derek gave me a creepy look and forcibly kissed me. I immediately tried to push him away, but then he pressed the knife against my neck and told me that if I moved or did anything else, he would kill me. I was absolutely terrified, watching the madness take over him. He was enjoying every second, adjusting the knife close to my neck and watching the fear wash over me. Suddenly, he looked at me again with those horrible, hateful eyes and started unbuttoning my pants. I started to beg him not to do it, but he just laughed in my face. But suddenly I saw someone come out of nowhere and hit Derek over the head with a piece of wood, which made him fall, passed out on the floor. At the time, I couldn't see who it was because Derek was blocking my view, but then I saw it clearly. It was Thomas. Thomas immediately hugged me, asking me if I was okay. I just nodded my head, unable to utter a word, and started crying like a little girl on his shoulder. I told him to get out of there, but he told me he had called the police and they were on their way. The cops arrived less than 5 minutes later, and Derek was still lying on the ground, passed out. For a moment I thought he was dead, but fortunately he only had a bad concussion from the blow Thomas gave him. After that, Derek was taken to the hospital by ambulance and subsequently placed under arrest. Thomas told me that he did not leave the park immediately. After I left, he stayed there for a few more moments. When he finally decided to walk towards the exit, he heard strange noises and then saw out of the corner of his eye that there was movement behind the monument wall, so he decided to go over there to see what was going on. And that's when he saw Derek pinning me against the wall, threatening to cut my throat with a knife, so he knew he had to act fast. That day I was very lucky that Thomas arrived at the right time, because if he hadn't, I don't even want to think about what that psycho Derek would have done to me. I might not even be here telling this story. After that, Derek was sentenced to 9 years in prison and is banned from coming near me for life. Thomas and I had a relationship that lasted a couple of years, but then we parted ways amicably. To this day, I attend therapy regularly to manage my anxiety and the panic attacks that eventually take me by storm. All of this as a result of the deep trauma that Hurricane Derek's passage through my life caused me. I wish I could erase the day I met that monster from my history, but all I can do is try to be resilient and move on with my life. It was a quiet night when I opened the Tinder app for the umpteenth time. I'd been talking to several girls, but one in particular caught my attention. Her name was Sarah. She had a smile that lit up the entire screen, and her photos reflected that she was a free spirit and really enjoyed traveling and doing things in nature. As soon as I saw her, I was quick to like her, and almost immediately we made a match. We started talking through the app and everything flowed very naturally. The conversations with them were very funny and had that touch that made me feel that we really understood each other. After a week or so of chatting, we decided it was time to meet in person. We arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown, a place that seemed like the perfect setting for our first date, relaxed and not too formal. When I arrived, I saw her sitting at a table near the window, looking at her phone. She was even more beautiful than in her photos, but something was the same, that smile that seemed to radiate light in every direction. Sarah and I greeted each other and exchanged nervous smiles at first, but then we started talking as if we had known each other all our lives. Everything was going great. We talked about movies, music, and laughed at each other's ridiculous anecdotes. But suddenly I noticed that her expression turned serious from one moment to the next. Sarah looked towards the door of the cafe and her smile faded. At the same time, her face turned pale. "What's wrong?" I asked her, somewhat confused. "Nothing, I think I just saw someone who shouldn't be here," she said in a whisper. I asked her who it was, but she just shook her head and told me it was nothing. Trying to calm her down, I told her to think of something funny, but I noticed that her gaze remained fixed on one spot in the cafeteria. When I dared to look, I saw a scruffy-looking guy wearing a black jacket that wasn't suitable for the weather, and I didn't realize it at the time, but something about his presence gave me a bad feeling. My instincts told me I had to stay away, but I didn't want to scare Sarah. She tried to hide her nervousness, but the tension in the air was palpable. After a while, she abruptly stood up and said, "Shall we go outside for a moment? I need to get some air." I was confused, but followed her. Once outside, she plopped against the wall, taking a deep breath. "It's my ex," she told me, her voice shaking. "He hasn't stopped looking for me since we broke up. He's dangerous, so we'd better go." At that moment, reality hit me like a bucket of cold water. That was the reason why Sarah was so nervous. I remembered that in a previous conversation she had told me about the horrible experience she had had with her ex. She told me that she had decided to leave him because he had started hanging out with gangs and had become very aggressive and controlling towards her. I also remembered that she mentioned something about him having been in prison. He was clearly not someone you wanted to deal with. I realized that she was right and decided that we had better leave. Sarah suggested that we move away from the cafe and go to her house, so I accompanied her, trying to make jokes and make her feel more comfortable. We walked down the street, but fear was in the air. I could feel her pulse racing and couldn't help but think about the guy she had seen. Suddenly, as we were walking, we heard footsteps behind us. I looked back and saw the guy in the black jacket now only a few feet away. My heart stopped at that moment. This man was rapidly approaching us with his hands in his jacket pockets and an expression of pure anger on his face. This man looked so intimidating that all I could say was, "Run, Sarah." There was no time to argue, so she nodded and we started running down the sidewalk. Immediately, the guy followed us and started running after us. He was like a shadow and he was getting closer and closer. Sarah and I ran at full speed, and in an attempt to lose him, we turned into an apartment complex off to the side. But then we realized we had made a big mistake. We had entered a dead end. "It's a dead end," I shouted back, feeling the adrenaline flood my body. At that moment, we turned and saw Sarah's ex-boyfriend walking towards us calmly with a smile on his face, but which did not reach his eyes, which were bloodshot. "Please don't hurt us," she begged him, starting to cry. I instinctively raised my hands as a sign that I didn't want any trouble, but then the guy pulled his hand out of his jacket, and my heart almost stopped when he pointed the gun at us. At that moment, panic took over my body, but before I could utter a word, a police cruiser parked right at the entrance to the alley. Two policemen got out, wielding their guns, and called out to the guy. He let out a curse before raising his hands and turning to look at the officers. At that instant, I felt my soul return to my body, because a second ago I was convinced that my end had come. The guy started looking around, looking for a possible escape route, but there was none. He was trapped. The policeman took his gun from him, put handcuffs on him, and took him away in the patrol car. Not before asking us if we were okay, to which Sarah and I nodded, feeling that we had been saved by divine grace. I would love to be able to tell you what happened to the guy after that, but I have no idea, because that was the last time I saw him and also Sarah. She was a cool girl, but I really wasn't sure I wanted to get into trouble like that, and she seemed to totally agree with me, because from then on we never spoke again. After that, I kept meeting girls through Tinder, until I met my current wife and deleted the app for good. However, whenever I met someone, I always made sure to ask them if they had any dangerous ex-boyfriends before dating them.